Hi, this is Dr. Stephen Seiler. I spent a lot of time thinking about the endurance training process and trying to measure it, trying to understand when things go wrong. And I gave a lecture based on a lot of this thinking and trying to kind of put it all together. I gave a lecture now it's a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, and it was part of a big digital conference. It was freely available for a short time, and then my lecture got put behind a paywall, and that I did not appreciate. So I'm going to make this lecture freely available here again. Now, you can't give the same lecture twice ever exactly, but the original title was this. And I guess now, if I was going to rethink it, or for a YouTube audience, I would say this is the difference. And it's simple. If we can understand these terms and what they mean in training, load, stress, strain, if we can understand them, practice them reasonably well in a simplified way, you'll get better. It'll help your endurance training, because this is confusing. It's easy to get kind of confused by all the metrics. So the first thing we want to talk about is, why do we measure? Why do we even measure or monitor in the first place? For me, there's at least 4 clear reasons. One, as a coach, I want to verify prescription execution. Did what I say, did the prescription get executed as intended? Because it often doesn't. There's often a mismatch between what we prescribe and what actually gets performed in that coach-athlete relationship for different reasons. And it's nothing nefarious. It just happens. And if we don't know that, if we don't understand that, then that can lead to confusion. Second, obviously, we want to use the feedback we get from measuring what happens to help us individualize and revise the training prescription over time. Because you shouldn't use just a plug-and-play 8-week plan and think that it's going to work optimally every day, because you're changing, things happen, and you got to adapt and modify. A third issue is we want to detect any kind of deterioration or deviation that's happening. And often I think of 3 different systems when I think of this. I think of what's going on at the muscular level. Is there fatigue? Is there muscle damage? And so forth. What's going on at the autonomic nervous system level, meaning things like heart rate changes relative to a given workload. And then if it gets really tough, you may see some hormone changes. This can be related to both overreaching, but also, in the worst case, overtraining. There's lots of things that can happen at the hormonal level over time that are quite serious, and also indicate a long-term change in our ability to absorb training. And then, obviously, a fourth reason, I think, is just to quantify the process and to try to document best practice, or at least the practice that you're using to achieve your results over time. So those are 4 reasons that I think we should monitor. Now, if we go to what we monitor and what all the terms are, well, it's confusing. There's lots of stuff. We can measure work, we can measure stress and session RPE and watts and strain and various kind of metrics that get developed thanks to our digital tools, thanks to the fact that we can measure power and pace, and we've got our GPS and our heart rate watches and so forth. So that's great. We've added potential to measure things, but we get confused. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out just 3 of these terms and try to make sense of them and try to distinguish them, because it's not so easy. And the terms I'm going to try to distinguish are these 3. I want to distinguish load, stress, and strain. Okay? Now, I'm going to just show you, if you go to the dictionary, you're going to see that all 3 of these terms overlap. They get used in similar ways. They're all 3 used as both nouns and verbs. I'm going to load him up, or the training load. Strain can be an injury. Strain can be a verb. He strained, she strained to pull the weight. So they're all different manifestations of something that seems kind of similar. So it gets really confusing, and certainly to me, and I suspect to others. So I'm going to go to this guy, and I'm going to start with our unpacking attempt here by going to Hans Selye. And whether you know it or not, Hans Selye has influenced your training, has influenced you if you're an exercise science student, if you're a coach, because it was Selye that developed what we call the general adaptation syndrome. He was a Hungarian-born guy who ended up living most of his life in Canada, but already as a 19-year-old medical student in Prague, he was going around listening to the various professors, and while he was going around, the professors were describing patients with tuberculosis or cancer or diabetes or pneumonia, different kinds of very clear diagnoses, and then they were very specific about what was happening. But what young Selye was seeing was kind of some general characteristics of these patients, whether they had the one disease or the other. They looked tired, they lacked appetite, they were losing weight, they wanted to lie down instead of stand, and they were not in the mood to go to work. And so the 19-year-old said, these patients all have the syndrome of being sick. And of course, a syndrome is often a term we use when, there's different ways to get to the same thing. So we call the end result this syndrome. All right. Now, he was a young medical student. He had to focus on his studies. So he kind of had to lay this on the shelf for about 10 years. But ultimately, he came back to it. And Selye spent a lot of time studying rats, putting them under different kinds of stress, like being in the cold or something like that. And ultimately, he developed this so-called general adaptation syndrome. And importantly for us, he kind of brought the term stress into the medical lexicon. And it moved out of the medical lexicon into psychology, into physiology, and so forth. So this happened way back in 1936, 65, 70 years ago. But he struggled for decades with his own term because, again, already then it could be used both as a noun and a verb. It was the cause and the effect. And his initial definition was the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. And then it evolved, and by the 70s he was saying stress is not what happens to you, but how you react to it, which is kind of more of a psychological definition. But here's what's interesting to me, and this is what really helped me to understand some things. That is that he probably didn't mean stress. The gentleman knew many languages, 8 different languages, but there's nuances in all, and particularly in English. And his colleagues have suggested that probably he meant the term strain when he used the term stress. Now, interesting. Why? Because physicists already use the term stress to describe the internal forces in an object when it's under a load, and they also already had a term strain, which they use to describe what happens when an object gets bent or stretched or pushed out of shape by the load. Okay? So the bottom line is that engineers have a very clear definition of these terms. So if we look at the screen here, engineers would say that if they're going to test the capacity of this wooden beam, they would then apply a load to it, and they would measure its cross-sectional area, its capacity, and then the stress on that beam would be equal to the load that's applied. That's just a neutral thing, the kilograms times the acceleration of gravity, divided by the capacity of that beam to tolerate the load. Okay? So that's very simple in engineering terms, the difference between load and stress. All right. And then what they would say is if the load gets big enough, then that object that's being tested, that steel beam or wooden beam or whatever it might be, will actually change shape. It will become deformed. And that deformation can actually be measured, and that deformation is, by definition, strain. Now, when the load gets removed, in some cases that wooden beam would just snap back quickly to its original shape. But if it's been under a load long enough or deeply enough, it may only slowly come back, or it may not come back at all. And of course, worst case scenario, load is heavy enough, then it might actually, the beam might break, right? It would reach its tolerance and snap or bend out of shape so much that it never regains its original shape. Well, this resonates with from the training perspective, okay? Now, training strain then is not defined by the training load that we put on our bodies, but by the temporary deformation of our physiological and psychological systems that result from mounting, from responding to the load with the required physiological response, a stress response. All right, so let's kind of try to think through that. Training loads are actions that we control. They're neutral. But in a biological system, the training load induces an adaptive signal. It induces signals, for example, for mitochondrial proliferation in the muscle, for blood volume increases, for cardiac adaptations, hypertrophy, a bigger heart chamber, and so forth. But it also comes at a price because those training sessions induce systemic stress. So we are in this job of trying to balance these. We want to achieve the training adaptations, and we want to maintain them, and we want these to accumulate over time. At the same time, we accept that there will be stress, that sometimes this will kind of slide into a strain reaction, a side effect, and we've got to manage and mitigate those. So we want to rebound from the strain while maintaining the adaptations. That's the challenge that we face in the endurance training process. So we monitor and we adapt and modify things in order to kind of maximize the stimulus over time and then achieve an acceptable level of strain. Now, what I mean by that is we're not going to ever get rid of strain. It happens, okay? Fatigue happens when we're pushing the boundaries of what we can tolerate, but we have to find the appropriate balance, or else the training process will either stagnate or even go in the wrong direction. And in my 20 years or more now of working on this subject, I have not figured out a way to do this by just measuring one variable, by one modality. You can't just go on power or pace as various zones. You can't just measure heart rate or blood lactate. You cannot either just measure perception. How do I feel? Sometimes those feelings lie a little bit. Perceived exertion and so forth. So you end up needing to use a triangulation of these three: the external workload, the physiological responses, and the perceptual measures. And when you do that, you get at this relationship, which is that external work versus the internal cost of doing that work. And that's what we're kind of trying to follow as we go. Now, training load is neutral. This is important. Training load is neutral, okay? And it only takes on meaning when you calibrate it against your capacity in two dimensions: intensity and duration. And this is a challenge here because we have a tendency to be intensity focused. But the two work in combination, and it's important to say, that different combinations of intensity and duration can be mathematically, what should we say, aggregated. We can multiply the one times the other and get some kind of a value, a score, in different ways. But that score doesn't necessarily, just because the number comes out the same, it doesn't mean it's the same stress. It's inducing the same physiological and perceptual responses on the body. So sometimes the math can lie. Now, training stress is acute. It occurs during the load, and we have to remember that the stress-load relationship is dynamic. What I mean by that is that VO2 max power or that lactate threshold or FTP power you have at the start of a workout or a race after your warm-up, that's not what you're sitting with 3 hours later when it gets hectic and you're trying to do the final climb up a hill. There's a dynamic process and there is a fatiguing process, a deterioration that is happening. Part of getting better as an athlete has to do with trying to delay that and avoid that. And the best athletes have a bigger percentage of their fresh power available compared to less well-trained. And then finally, training strain, we have to see is a response or a variable that we're going to see unfold and it be identified as it happens in subsequent workouts. Okay, so fatigue, in the early hours after a workout, there are fatigue processes. So the body is deteriorated. You would not be able to have the same capacity 3 hours after a hard workout. We get that. But if we push out 24 hours to the next workout, then if there are residual changes in perceptual responses in the physiology, then we're going to look at those as kind of strain responses. Okay? And so it is important to distinguish the fatigue from this slower recovering strain response if it happens. Okay? Now, training stress is a dynamic, non-linear function of how we apply that load. All right, now we're getting kind of fancy here, but by non-linear I mean you can't think of the hours that you train as Lego blocks where the first hour and the second hour and the third hour at the same intensity are all the same load or stress, because they won't be. That third hour will be different. It will be a bigger stress on the body than that first hour at any given intensity, I can almost assure you. And if you're able to do it for 3 hours, then it's probably at a fairly low intensity. Take this as an example. Now we start with interval training. If I prescribe to you, say 6 times 4 minutes like you see here, that first 4-minute bout, if you pace this workout correctly, that first 4-minute bout will feel hard, but not terribly hard. It will feel, you say, I'm okay with this. And heart rate responses won't be very high. But as that workout progresses, even though you hold the same absolute load in watts or pace, your internal load, the internal responses are increasing. So this workout is becoming essentially more stressful. And how deep you go into your reserves will be dictated, or will maybe dictate the downstream effects, the strain response, the recovery demands the next day. Now, this is true at high intensity, but it's also true when we do lower intensity sessions. For example, here, now this is me back when I was starting to cycle again, doing some indoor training. I was in a leadership position. I had a leg injury, and I realized I had to get my behind back in gear and do some work. So if you look at the red line, that's December of 18. I had been cycling maybe 4 months. And now I'm able to at least do a reasonable workout. So here I'm doing a 3.5 hour workout at 205 watts. And what you see is for about the first 90 minutes of that time, my heart rate is quite stable at about 65% of my maximum heart rate on the bike. But then pretty suddenly it just starts deviating. It starts sliding up, even though I hold the power output the same. So I start seeing that classic cardiac drift, and it's feeling tougher, and it's, my legs are becoming emptier, and I'm kind of wanting to get off the bike after 3.5 hours. Not kind of, I definitely want to. Now, if you look at the green line, that's 6 months later, exact same workout. And now you see the heart rate response is a little bit lower at the baseline, but more importantly, I don't see as much of that drift. It's more delayed, and it's less substantial. So you might say that my body is becoming more durable, even though I can tell you that my FTP did not improve significantly during that time. I would say not more than 5-10 watts. Okay, so it was a very small change there, but big change in my durability when I was doing these long, low intensity workouts. Now, I decided I wanted to be able to calibrate that and in a better way and make it more comparable. So I went back to Carvonen and used the heart rate reserve, which is just our maximum heart rate minus our resting heart rate. That gives you your range. Those are the number of beats you have to work with during exercise. So we can use that as a calibration because we have different maximum heart rates and different resting heart rates. And then I also, after, you might say, playing a little bit, said about 6-minute power is a good proxy. If I take my maximum power that I can maintain for 6 minutes, or that an athlete can maintain their pace also, if I use that as a surrogate for maximum aerobic power, it turns out that the ratio of the percentage of heart rate reserve you're at relative to the percentage of your 6-minute power you're at is about 1. It can range between 0.9 and 1.1 in different athletes, but it hovers around 1 when we're fresh and rested and early during a workout, once we've warmed up. So I use that as kind of a calibration. Now, when you do that, and then I've worked with a guy named John Peters in the UK, and he's created some software, and we've worked together on this. So here you're seeing just a training file that has been put into that program, and then this is 2 hours at 200 watts. The green is the power as a percentage of 6-minute power. What percentage of my maximum 6-minute power am I at? And then the colored segments are heart rate reserve. What percentage of my heart rate reserve am I using to achieve that power? And then just broken up into 15-minute blocks. And what you see here, well, it's very boring because this is not changing. That relationship between those two variables is staying quite consistent. And this is, I would say, an easy workout for me now. 2 hours at 200 watts. I can do this. It's really not stressful. You would really say it's just a upward shift in the equilibrium. It's a physiological shift necessary to meet the demand, but there's no excessive stress. Now, if I go to this scenario, now I've increased the load to 255 watts, which for me is right in the middle of my threshold. Now what we see is that initially those two are again aligned, and you see that here as it's pretty close to 1 here, but then it starts to shift and heart rate starts to climb relative to power. Okay, so that's that decoupling, and I can assure you that during this stage things are feeling more challenging, and it feels tougher and tougher and tougher despite the same workload. All right, so the question then becomes, well, how far should I go down this decoupling path? And before I say that's enough training for today, that's enough stimuli, because if I keep pushing this too far, well, it's going to cost me so much on the recovery side that it ends up not being worth it. All right. Now, am I representative? Well, I'm a reasonable endurance type, but good grief, boy, here's an example of just how much better it can go. This is a Norwegian young pro cyclist who during the lockdown period, he did a 13-hour Zwift ride where he sat on the bike for 13 hours. There are some occasional potty breaks or pee breaks, but they kind of get deleted by the Garmin system here. But what you see is his baseline is he has a little bit higher. ratio. It's about 1.1 is his typical ratio between his percentage of heart reserve and his 6-minute maximum power. But after he gets warmed up, 3 hours, maybe burns off some carbohydrates and he gets into real fat burning, he just stays really stable at this power output, and even kicks it in over the last 3 hours and increases his power output by about 10-15 watts, and just handles it amazingly well. Could I do that? No, I don't think so ever. This workout here just shows you the difference. This is an athlete with probably an extremely high percentage of slow twitch fibers versus this guy who, I know that based on biopsies I had when I was younger, I have a lot of fast twitch fibers. I'm one of these tweeners or mixed person that, doesn't handle the really, really long stuff as well. So you do see the differences. And this is an extreme example of an athlete that's a pure slow twitch diesel, you might say. Now, what we have done here is back about 5-6 months ago now, during the lockdown, the first lockdown in March and April, I recruited some people to do 4-hour rides. About 43 ended up being a part of this. 43 people, males and females, did 4-hour rides, having estimated their 60-minute functional threshold power. I knew their resting heart rate, their max heart rate. So we used that same calibration, and then we looked at how that internal versus external relationship changed. And what we see is, it varied. These are people training up to 12 hours a week, or typically around 12 on average. And that was pretty similar for all three of these groups. But some of them, you see, showed very little of this drift or decoupling. Others showed a moderate amount. And then you had some that showed a very high degree of decoupling. And in general, those who showed this high decoupling also showed a higher drift upward of their perceived exertion. Okay, and that makes sense. They're connected, right? Now, what's distinguishing them? Partly a little bit, these were at a bit higher training level. It might be that these tended to be a bit heavier, which means they're going to have somewhat more difficulty getting rid of heat. So there's some subtle differences. And then, of course, some of it is just genetic differences in their fiber composition and so forth. So here you see differences that emerge even at low intensity. Now, I was flying across Canada about 1.5 years ago now, and I created this, and it was based on this idea of, what's my chronic training load, my chronic workload, and what can I handle in 2 hours at 60-65% of VO2 max as a low intensity session would be typical for me, very manageable for me. So you might imagine that if I just train for an hour, then that might not even be enough of a signal to maintain my fitness over time. I would eventually detrain if I went down from 2 to 1 hour at that same pace. If I continue to do 2-hour workouts at that pace, then I'm going to maintain that level of capacity or fitness. If I extend, and I want to occasionally push myself, and I want to extend my capability, my long intensity, now I start to increase the signal for adaptation, but I also increase the stress. Now I start to see that decoupling, right? I start to see, a lot more glycogen depletion, some cortisol increase, and so forth. So now the body is becoming stressed, and that internal to external workload is shifting. And if I were to go another hour, then it really gets tough, you might imagine. So now what I'm saying to you, if you think about it, is that it would be wrong to think of each of these hours during that workout as the same stress. If you were going to give it a stress score, it's the same load, because load is neutral, but it's not the same resulting stress. And that's why we have to be able to distinguish load from stress. Okay? And the reason we want to do that is because when we increase the stress, we're also going to likely increase the strain that results over time. So that's the logical sequencing. Load, stress, strain. Now, I'm not going to say to you, you want Seiler stress points, so we don't need a new metric, but I want you to just imagine that in this scenario, if I were going to put points to it, then it might be that this fourth hour was 3 times as stressful as that first hour. Now, that's just purely hypothetical, but what I can assure you is it's not the same. This hour and this hour are not the same at the physiological level. Okay? Now, for all of these reasons, that's one of the reasons I think it's important for us to think that in terms of not just VO2 max power and threshold power or FTP, but also to think about this idea of durability, how our bodies improve the ability to maintain a low intensity or sub-threshold pace or power longer without the big stress response. And as kind of a piggyback on top of that, we improve our ability to repeat high intensity bouts during a race. And that's very important in many kinds of activities like mountain bike, like road racing and cycling and so forth, is that the race is not steady state. There are surges, there are climbs, and it is often a war of attrition. And so the repeatability is extremely important, and that's part of the training process. And it doesn't show up as an improvement in VO2 max power or FTP necessarily if you've been training for a long time. Now here's an example of, this is from the recent 2020 men's cycling road race, the World Championship road race. It was held in Italy. This is from a top 40 finisher from Norway that did the race. The race was repeats of a loop, so there was 9 repeats of the same loop. With this blue line shows these climbs, the elevation changes, and you see, of course, that the heart rate is increasing during these climbs. Now, if I break the workout, or I should say the race, into 3 phases, you can look at the average power, and it goes from being, reasonable, it's something that I almost think I could do, and then it just slowly gets tougher and tougher. The power is going up as the duration and the fatigue extends. The hours add up. This is a 6-hour and 40-minute race. So you can understand that after 4 hours, 4.5, that's when things are really starting to become decisive, and now you're seeing the highest loads. And this is a war of attrition, and here the athlete ultimately gets dropped in the nearly at the beginning of the 9th lap. Okay? So that athlete is going to continually want to improve his high intensity repeatability to be able to be at the finish. Now, this is me, or this is my little setup. And the reason I show you this is just to show you how I have to also think about other external factors when I'm training that influence this internal to external workload relationship and this load, stress, strain sequence that we might see. So what do you see? You see fans, because I've got to get rid of heat. You see water bottles. You see ventilation. This has to be there. And when we are not well hydrated, when we're not able to get good airflow across the skin, then the body has to respond by moving more blood, sweating more, moving more blood to the skin to remove heat. And so we create an additional stress on the body to maintain the same power output. So these are things that I will constantly remind us of, especially in periods where we're training more indoors, because training indoors, often we have a compromised ventilation system. We have a compromised airflow situation, and we forget to drink. So all of those things can impact how we respond to these different workouts. And if we extend that, then when you do things like a morning fast, you get up in the morning, you do an early workout fasted, that's going to change the physiological responses relative to having eaten. If you're at altitude, if it's hot outside, hot heat and humidity will dramatically change things. So all of these variables need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at that relationship. And anticipating how you're going to respond to a certain training load. Because if you're exercising in the heat, if you're at altitude, then that same 3-hour ride or same 90-minute run will not be the same degree of stress, and it'll add up to a bigger strain on your body during those periods when it's a heat wave or you're at altitude or so forth. And it's really important to remember. Now, let's go to the third and finish with this. What is strain? What's it look like? Okay, strain, we talked about it being a deformation, some kind of we've shifted something, and the physiology is bent a bit in relation to its normal response. One of the things you might feel is just muscle soreness. If you've added a bunch of strength training you're not used to, you're going to have some delayed onset muscular soreness. Well, that's a strain response that you're going to feel in the day or 2 or 3 following that big strength session. Your psychology changes, your motivation to train, your perception, your mood state changes when you're fatigued. And training camps, this is classic. When you've gone about a week and you've been training hard, you see around the breakfast table, the heads are dropping, the smiles have disappeared, the jokes have faded, and it's getting tough. Okay, the toughness of the load, the toughness of just being kind of sequestered and so forth. So that's a strain response. Perceived exertion during the workout gets higher, and then something that's a bit tricky is heart rate at a given workload can either shift up or down somewhat significantly. A 10 beat higher heart rate at the same pace, 10 beat lower. Well, that's not a training effect, that's a strain response. All right, and it can go in 2 different directions because of different mechanisms that are causing it. I'll try to explain that a little bit more. You may also see that maximum heart rate is lower. If you're trying to do high intensity intervals, you're missing a gear, you can't get up to max heart rate. And then you may also see that your maximum blood lactate, if you're doing hard, high intensity bouts, your lactate actually goes down. You can't actually get that really high power output for 30 seconds and so forth. All of these are indications of a strain response to the training that's been going on. Now, we tend to say that if lactate or heart rate is lower at a given workload, that's positive. That is an improvement. And over time, that's true. But when it happens acutely during, say, a period of heavy training, it's often not a positive. Here's an example here. Here you see a study where one group of athletes, 2 groups were trained heavy. They increased their training load, but some of these athletes did not show a heavy response or a overreaching response, and some of them did. And they tended to all go down a bit in heart rate, but the overreaching athletes at low intensity, at threshold, at high intensity, and even at max, they all had lower heart rates. So if you were just looking at the low intensity responses, you might conclude, they're fitter because their heart rate is lower. But the reason it's lower is because the entire system has been, you might say, the brakes have come on, or in this case, they call it parasympathetic hyperactivity. The parasympathetic system is trying or is over dominant, and the sympathetic system is depressed. All right, and so this is part of you can see a lower heart rate in this situation, and it's not a positive. It says this athlete needs rest. Now, in that vein, I have thought about, and others have too, of using the warm-up before a ride or before a run, before a workout, as a tool to guide decisions. And so I sent out a Twitter and asked, do people use a standardized warm-up? Do they maybe use the warm-up and just kind of go more on perception? Do they, or do they not use it? And in general, very few people do a standardized warm-up. All right. Most people go on feeling. And there were also a lot of responses that said, even if the warm-up doesn't feel quite right, it doesn't always mean that the workout won't go well. So they tend to say, I'm going to at least start, if I'm going to do an interval session, I'll at least start the interval session to see how that first one feels before I eventually say, no, I'm not ready, or I abandon it. So I think that's interesting, and I certainly respect that. But I have played a bit with it. And here you see an example. I tried myself just to use a kind of a ramp protocol where what you're looking at is this black line is my power, which I'm trying, at first I just tried to smoothly make it go up from 60 watts or 0 and then up to 60, and then just kept adding 20 watts per minute, and then looking at how heart rate responded. And what I saw was, when I was fresh, that once I got into that typical workout range, then I was at that 1-to-1 relationship between my heart rate and my power output. And then I do a race, that the warm-up was before this race. Then I do this 2 hour and 10-minute very stochastic race where every lap during this race has a big surge. And the average is 280, which is for me, upper end of my, or at least in the middle of my threshold. And I am really fatigued at the end of this. This is tough on me and my, with my physiology. So then when I go back the next day and do the same warm up here, now I see that my heart rate is not responding. I am depressed here. You see the heart rate is not coming up to the same level. So I've actually got a lower heart rate. I'm missing a gear 32 hours post. So there's a strain reaction. And then when I wait another day, well, I'm back to normal. I'm recovered, at least based on this ramp, looking at the relationship, with my heart rate during the warm up. So this is a potential way of detecting it, but this is tough. It's hard to do a ramp. I'm doing this indoors, and doing this outside would be hard. And so I've tried to simplify this, because no one would ever use it if it didn't work, if it's not simple. So I've gone now recently to just doing 3-minute steps, starting at about 50% of my FTP, my 60-minute power, and progressing up to about 90% of it, and then looking at the heart rate response. And this may be useful, we'll see, but there's a challenge here, because when you do a warm-up, you are warming up. So there's a caveat here, and that is that the heart rate is also increasing relative to the power as core temperature gets higher. So you got to factor these things in and be consistent. I'm going to be experimenting with this some more with more people and working with some teams. So we'll see whether it's a tool. Other people have used, a warm-up procedure, but we have to be careful and make sure it's not too hard, because if it's going to be used during a rest day or something, or a recovery day, we don't want the warm-up procedure to be stressful in itself. So, finish there. But the big take-home message for you that I want you to get out of this is what the picture you see right now, which is load, stress, strain. Load is neutral. It is a combination of intensity and duration. It can be calibrated based on your percentage of your threshold power or whatever, but that's still a neutral load. You can achieve it with different combinations of intensity and duration. And then the stress response that is generated by that load, well, we're interested in looking at that and how that's happening. How does that change with fitness? The same load calibrated at the same percentage of our FTP, we get better at handling it. We have less stress. And then we want to be able to also see when strain responses occur. When we've pushed on the accelerator consecutive days, we've had a weekend of hard racing, we've had several hard workouts in a row, we've kind of not, if we haven't paid attention to rest and recovery or low and high intensity balance, we may see a shift towards a more longer lasting strain response. And this can be picked up with, perceptual measures. It can be picked up with that heart rate to load shift, either that's pretty significant up or down. If it's shifted up, often that means that there's muscular fatigue, there's muscular damage, and so the brain is having to recruit more muscle perhaps to do the same work, so we might see a higher heart rate at the same load. But if we're talking about a chronic training load that's been high, we may see this sympathetic brakes coming on, or it's also sometimes seen as a parasympathetic hyperactivity, and where the heart rate would actually be lower than it should be at a given load. So both of those can happen, and you have to be measuring things to see it. And say, oh, I need some rest. We could see peak lactates go down. You might, if you do a neuromuscular test like a jump test or a peak power test, that it might be down if the athlete is fatigued. And then finally, resting heart rate variability might be a good indicator of strain. So all of these, or different combinations of them, can help you to see when you've gone into that strain situation and you need to take off the gas, you need to add a rest day, you need to perhaps add more easy days before you do another hard session. All right, load, stress, strain. I hope that was helpful. And we're always trying to make things as simple as possible without making them so simple that they're just wrong. But I think this simplification, thinking in terms of this progression, load, stress, strain, does help, and it does have logical validity. And engineers have been using it for decades. All right, good luck. Bye-bye.